Chicago, Illinois, 1973. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through Marcus Thompson's coat as he stepped off the bus on South Cottage Grove Avenue. At 32, Marcus was a welder at the Pullman Standard factory, his hands scarred from years of shaping steel. He lived in Englewood, a black neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, in a two-bedroom apartment with his wife Dolores and their two kids, Tanya, 10, and Michael, 7. The building was crumbling, leaky pipes, peeling paint, but it was home, one of the few places a black family could rent in a city carved up by redlining. Marcus's life was a balancing act: work, family, and the unspoken rules that governed being black in Chicago. Step too far, dream too big, and the city would remind you of your place. Englewood wasn't always this way. Dolores's father, Reverend Clarence Brooks, had preached at Greater Salem Baptist Church on 63rd Street since the 1950s, when the neighborhood was a mix of black and white families. By 1973, white flight had drained the area of resources. The banks wouldn't lend, the city wouldn't fix the streets, and the police patrolled like occupiers. Marcus saw it every day: the boarded-up storefronts, the kids playing in vacant lots, the squad cars circling like vultures. He'd grown up in Bronzeville, another black enclave, and remembered his mother Alma warning him about the line. Not a real line, but a boundary between black neighborhoods and white ones, between safety and danger. Cross it, and you'd pay. That spring, Marcus and Dolores decided to buy a house. Tanya was outgrowing her bunk bed, and Michael needed a yard to run in. They'd saved $4,000, a small miracle on Marcus's $6.50 an hour wage and Dolores's part-time job as a nurse's aide at Provident Hospital. They wanted to stay in Englewood, near Reverend Brooks and their church, but the houses there were either overpriced or falling apart. Their real estate agent, a wiry black man named Harold Washington, years before he'd become Chicago's first black mayor, suggested looking west, in Lawndale or Garfield Park. "It's still black, still affordable," Harold said, adjusting his tie. "Yeah, but you gotta watch the contracts." Marcus didn't know much about contract buying, but he soon learned. In Chicago, redlining blocked black families from getting mortgages in white areas, or even stable black ones. Instead, they were pushed into contract sales, high-interest deals where buyers paid monthly but didn't own the house until the full price was met. Miss a payment, and you lost everything. Harold showed them a brick bungalow on South Kedzie Avenue in Lawndale, with 3 bedrooms and a small backyard. The seller, a white man named Leonard Weiss, wanted $25,000, with $1,000 down and $200 a month at 12% interest. Marcus did the math. It'd take 20 years to pay off, nearly double the house's value. "It's a trap," Dolores whispered as they stood in the empty living room, her voice echoing off the cracked plaster. But the kids' laughter from the backyard made Marcus sign the papers. He wanted them to have more than he'd had. The move wasn't easy. Lawndale was rougher than Englewood, with gangs like the Vice Lords claiming corners. The Thompsons' new street, 16th and Kedzie, had potholes deep enough to swallow tires, and the nearest grocery, a mile away, charged double for wilted produce. Dolores hung curtains and planted marigolds, trying to make the house a home. Tanya and Michael started at Sumner Elementary, a segregated school with outdated books and overworked teachers. Marcus worked overtime at Pullman to cover the payments, his shifts stretching from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. He came home exhausted, his hands smelling of metal, but Dolores's smile and the kids' hugs kept him going. The city's racism wasn't just in housing. In June 1973, Marcus was stopped by police while driving home from a late shift. 2 white officers, their badges glinting under a streetlight, claimed he'd run a red light on Pulaski Road. Marcus knew he hadn't, but he kept his hands on the wheel, his voice low. "Just heading home, officers." They searched his car, tore the upholstery, and left him with a $50 ticket he couldn't afford. Dolores was furious when he told her. "They're hunting us," she said, her eyes flashing. She'd seen it before. Her cousin Ronnie was beaten by police in 1968 during the riots after Dr. King's assassination. Ronnie never walked right again. The Thompsons leaned on their community. Reverend Brooks held barbecues at Greater Salem, where families shared stories and strategies. One neighbor, Miss Ella Mae Carter, a 60-year-old seamstress, taught Dolores how to stretch a dollar with homemade meals. Another, Curtis Hayes, a Vietnam vet who ran a barber shop on 63rd, gave Marcus free haircuts and news from the streets. Curtis was part of the Chicago Freedom Movement, a coalition pushing for fair housing and jobs, started by Dr. King in 1966. "They're still redlining us," Curtis told Marcus over a trim, "but we're fighting back." Curtis invited Marcus to a meeting of the Contract Buyers League, CBL, a group of black homeowners suing predatory sellers like Leonard Weiss. Marcus went, curious but skeptical. The meeting, held in a church basement on West Madison, was packed. 100 people, mostly black, sharing stories of missed payments and evictions. The CBL's leader, Clyde Ross, a 50-year-old factory worker, spoke plainly. "They're stealing our wealth. We sue, or we lose everything." Marcus signed up, his signature a small act of defiance. By fall, the CBL was making waves. They filed a lawsuit against 40 real estate firms, including Weiss's, accusing them of discriminatory contract sales. Marcus and Dolores joined protests outside City Hall, their kids holding signs that read, "Fair Housing Now." The Chicago Tribune, a white-owned paper, called the protests disruptive. But the black press, the Defender and the Crusader, cheered them on. Dolores wrote a letter to the Defender, signing her name. "We're not asking for handouts, we're asking for justice." It was printed on October 12, 1973, and Reverend Brooks read it aloud at church, his voice booming with pride. But justice was elusive. In November, Leonard Weiss raised the Thompsons' monthly payment to $225, citing maintenance fees. Marcus confronted him at his downtown office, a sleek building on LaSalle Street. Weiss, a balding man in a pinstripe suit, barely looked up. "Pay or leave," he said, shuffling papers. Marcus left, his anger simmering. That night, he and Dolores sat up late, their kitchen table covered with bills. "We can't keep this up," Dolores said, her voice tight. Marcus nodded, thinking of Tanya's dream to be a doctor, Michael's love for drawing. He couldn't let Weiss take their future. Chicago, Illinois, 1974. Marcus Thompson sat at the kitchen table, the dim light of a single bulb casting shadows on the stack of bills before him. The $225 monthly payment to Leonard Weiss, their contract seller, was a noose tightening around his family's future. At 33, Marcus was working 60-hour weeks at the Pullman Standard factory, his welder's mask shielding his face, but not his fears. Dolores, 31, was picking up extra shifts at Provident Hospital, her nurse's aide uniform starched but her patience fraying. Their kids, Tanya, now 11, and Michael, 8, were asleep in the next room, unaware of the math that kept their parents awake. $225 for the house, $80 for utilities, $50 for groceries, and nothing left for emergencies. Lawndale's streets, pitted and neglected, mirrored their struggle. A black neighborhood starved by a city that thrived on its division. The Contract Buyers League was their lifeline. Marcus and Dolores attended weekly meetings at Mount Zion Baptist Church on West Madison, where Clyde Ross and other leaders mapped out their lawsuit against predatory real estate firms. The CBL had grown to 500 families by January 1974, all black, all trapped in contracts that bled them dry. Marcus listened as Ruth Wells, a 45-year-old mother of 6, shared her story. She'd paid $30,000 over 15 years for a house worth $12,000, only to face eviction when she missed one payment. "They're not selling us homes," Ruth said, her voice trembling. "They're selling us debt." Marcus thought of his own contract with Weiss, the 12% interest rate that doubled the house's cost. He and Dolores joined the CBL's payment strike, refusing to pay Weiss until the contract was renegotiated. It was a gamble. Eviction loomed, but doing nothing felt like surrender. The strike made headlines. On February 10, 1974, the Chicago Defender ran a front-page story. "Black homeowners fight back against contract sharks." Dolores clipped the article, taping it to their fridge beside Tanya's spelling bee ribbon. The white-owned Chicago Tribune was less kind, calling the strikers delinquent tenants and quoting Weiss's lawyer, who claimed the contracts were fair market deals. Marcus didn't trust the Tribune, but he read it at Curtis Hayes's barber shop, where the air smelled of talc and dissent. Curtis, the Vietnam vet who'd introduced Marcus to the CBL, was blunt. "They'll lie to protect their own, always have." Curtis showed Marcus a 1971 report by the Chicago Urban League, which detailed how redlining and contract sales had cost black families $500 million in equity since the 1950s. Marcus felt the number like a punch. His parents, Alma and Henry, had lost their Bronzeville home to a similar contract in 1965. He wouldn't let it happen to Tanya and Michael. The strike wasn't just financial, it was personal. In March, Weiss sent a notice threatening eviction if the Thompsons didn't pay the full $225 by April 1st. Dolores, furious, called a CBL lawyer, Charles Good, a 38-year-old black attorney who'd taken on the case pro bono. Good met them at their bungalow, his briefcase stuffed with depositions. "Weiss is banking on you folding," Good said, adjusting his glasses. "He's done this to 200 families in Lawndale alone." Good filed an injunction to block the eviction, citing discriminatory lending practices under the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Marcus didn't understand the legalese, but he trusted Good's fire. Dolores, ever practical, started a savings jar labeled Freedom Fund, hiding it behind the flour canister. "For when Weiss comes knocking," she said, her smile fierce. Lawndale's challenges went beyond housing. Sumner Elementary, where Tanya and Michael studied, was a microcosm of the city's neglect. The school, 95% black, had no library, outdated textbooks, and a heating system that failed every winter. Tanya, bright and curious, came home one day with a torn math book, its pages missing fractions. "How am I supposed to learn, Daddy?" she asked, her braids swinging. Marcus's heart sank. He and Dolores joined the school's parent council, led by Gloria Jenkins, a 40-year-old teacher who'd marched with Dr. King in 1966. Gloria organized a protest at the Chicago Board of Education on March 15, 1974, demanding equal funding for black schools. Marcus took a rare day off work, standing with Dolores and 200 parents outside the board's downtown office. Tanya and Michael held signs, "Books, not barriers." The board promised review, but no money came. Dolores started a book drive at Greater Salem Baptist Church, collecting donations from black businesses. Reverend Brooks blessed the effort, calling it a fight for our children's minds. The police were another constant threat. In June 1974, Marcus witnessed a beating outside Jackson's Market. A 16-year-old, Jamal Carter, was slammed against a squad car by 2 white officers for loitering. Jamal's mother, Ella Mae Carter, the seamstress who'd taught Dolores recipes, screamed as the officers cuffed her son. Marcus wanted to intervene, but Dolores grabbed his arm. "They'll take you too," she whispered, her eyes wide. Jamal was released with a bruised eye and a $100 fine, but the incident lit a fuse. Curtis Hayes organized a community watch, training residents to document police stops with notebooks and cameras. Marcus joined, carrying a pocket-sized pad on his delivery runs. On July 20th, he recorded a stop. A black teen, no older than 15, patted down on Roosevelt Road for suspicious behavior. The officer's nameplate read O'Malley. Marcus mailed the notes to the CBL, who shared them with the Afro-American Patrolmen's League, a group of black officers pushing for reform. The summer brought personal strain. Marcus's overtime left him little time with Tanya and Michael, who spent days at church camp or with Ella Mae. Dolores, exhausted from hospital shifts and CBL meetings, snapped at Marcus one night over a late dinner. "You're never here," she said, her fork clattering. Marcus felt the sting. He was fighting for their home, but losing his family. He took the kids to Washington Park the next day, watching Tanya sketch the lagoon and Michael chase dragonflies. "Are we going to lose the house, Daddy?" Michael asked, his eyes wide. Marcus hugged him. "Not if I can help it, son." That night, he and Dolores reconciled, promising to face Weiss together. By fall, the CBL's lawsuit gained traction. On September 12, 1974, a federal judge agreed to hear Ross v. Weiss et al., citing evidence of racial discrimination. Marcus and Dolores attended the first hearing at the Dirksen Federal Building, their hands clasped. Clyde Ross testified, his voice steady. "We paid for homes we'll never own." Marcus saw Weiss in the courtroom, his face impassive. The judge set a trial for 1975, a small victory but a long wait. Outside, protesters chanted, "No justice, no peace." Tanya, now taller, joined them, her sign bolder, "Stop stealing our homes." The year ended with a church barbecue at Greater Salem. Reverend Brooks prayed for strength, his voice rising over the hum of cicadas. Marcus looked at Dolores, Tanya, and Michael, their faces lit by string lights. The fight wasn't over. Weiss's threats, the police, the school's neglect loomed, but they were still standing. Curtis raised a glass. "To the line we're crossing." Marcus nodded, his scars a map of the battle ahead. Chicago, Illinois, 1975. Marcus Thompson stood in the crowded courtroom of the Dirksen Federal Building, his calloused hands clasped tightly in his lap. The Ross v. Weiss et al. Lawsuit filed by the Contract Buyers League was finally in trial, and the air was thick with tension. At 34, Marcus felt the weight of every payment he'd made to Leonard Weiss, the predatory contract seller who owned their Lawndale bungalow, or rather, owned their debt. Dolores, 32, sat beside him, her nurse's aide uniform pressed beneath her coat, her eyes fixed on Clyde Ross as he faced the judge. Tanya, now 12, and Michael, 9, were at Greater Salem Baptist Church with Reverend Brooks, safe from the courtroom stakes, but not from the city's dangers. The Thompsons' fight wasn't just for their home, it was for a future Chicago wouldn't give them willingly. The trial, which began on March 3, 1975, was a battle of narratives. Charles Good, the CBL's black lawyer, presented evidence of systemic discrimination. Contracts with inflated prices, exorbitant interest rates, and eviction clauses targeting black families. He called witnesses like Ruth Wells, who testified about losing her home after 15 years of payments, and John McKnight, a Northwestern University professor, whose 1972 study showed black contract buyers paid 80% more than white homeowners for comparable properties. Marcus watched Leonard Weiss's lawyer, a sharp-suited white man named Robert Kaplan, counter with claims of market fairness and buyer responsibility. Kaplan's words stung. Marcus had worked overtime at Pullman Standard for years, his welders, scars proof of his responsibility, yet Weiss held the deed to their lives. Outside the courtroom, the CBL kept the pressure on. On March 15th, Marcus and Dolores joined 300 protesters at Daley Plaza, chanting "End contract slavery." Tanya, taller and bolder, carried a sign, "Homes, not hustles." The Chicago Defender covered the rally, quoting Clyde Ross, "We're not asking for charity, we're demanding equity." The Chicago Tribune, predictably, framed the protesters as agitators, ignoring the $500 million in wealth stripped from black families since the 1950s. Dolores, undeterred, wrote another letter to the Defender, published on March 20th. "Our children deserve homes, not nightmares." Marcus framed it, hanging it beside Tanya's latest drawing, a sketch of their bungalow, marigolds blooming. Lawndale was unraveling. The vice lords and disciples' rival gangs were tightening their grip, recruiting kids as young as Michael. On April 10th, Marcus saw a 13-year-old Ricky Jones selling dime bags on 16th Street, his eyes hollow. Ricky's mother, a CBL member, had been evicted the year before, and the family was couch surfing. Marcus tried talking to Ricky, offering to bring him to Greater Salem's youth program, but Ricky shrugged. "Church ain't paying the bills," he said, walking away. Marcus told Dolores that night, his voice heavy, "We got to keep Michael close." Dolores nodded, her hands busy sewing Tanya's choir robe. They enrolled Michael in an after-school art class at the church, led by Curtis Hayes, the barbershop owner and Vietnam vet. Curtis taught the kids to draw cityscapes, channeling their energy into pencils instead of fists. The police were a growing menace. On May 25, 1975, a 19-year-old named Larry Jenkins was shot by a white officer, Thomas Brady, outside a Lawndale liquor store. Brady claimed Jenkins had a gun. Witnesses said he was unarmed, running from a gang fight. The community erupted. Marcus and Dolores joined 500 residents in a march down Pulaski Road, organized by the Afro-American Patrolmen's League and the Chicago Urban League. Ella Mae Carter, Jamal's mother, spoke at the rally, her voice raw. "They're killing our boys!" The Tribune called it a riot. The Defender called it grief. Marcus documented the march with his notebook, noting Brady's badge number and the crowd's chants, "No justice, no peace." The officer faced no charges, but the march led to a community policing forum at Mount Zion Baptist, where black officers like Renault Robinson pushed for reform. Marcus attended, skeptical but hopeful, his notes now a stack he shared with Curtis. Sumner Elementary remained a battleground. Tanya, excelling in science, was invited to a citywide STEM fair, but needed a $30 fee for materials. Marcus, stretched thin, sold his father's old watch to cover it. Dolores, meanwhile, expanded her book drive, collecting 200 books for the school by June. Gloria Jenkins, the teacher leading the parent council, praised her. "You're building a library, Dolores." But the school board's neglect persisted. On June 12th, parents staged a sit-in at Sumner, demanding a new boiler and updated texts. Marcus took a half-day off, risking his boss's wrath to join Dolores. The sit-in made the evening news, but the board's response was a vague promise of future funding. Tanya, watching the coverage, asked, "Why don't they care, Mama?" Dolores hugged her. "They care about power, baby. We're taking it back." The personal toll was mounting. Marcus's overtime left him with chronic back pain, and Dolores's hospital shifts triggered migraines. One night in July, Tanya overheard them arguing about a missed payment to Weiss. "Are we going to be homeless?" she asked, her voice small. Marcus knelt beside her. "Never, sweetheart. We're fighters." To ease the strain, Reverend Brooks organized a community potluck at Greater Salem on August 1st, 1975. Families brought greens, cornbread, and stories. Curtis played Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," and Michael danced, his grin a rare light. Ella May shared news. The CBL had won a preliminary ruling, forcing Weiss to freeze evictions until the trial's end. The crowd cheered, but Marcus knew it was temporary. Weiss's lawyers were appealing, and the trial could drag into 1976. By fall, Tanya's STEM Fair project, a model solar panel, won second place, earning her a $50 prize and a photo in asterisk, the Defender asterisk. Marcus and Dolores framed it, their pride outweighing their exhaustion, but the city's violence crept closer. On October 15th, Michael saw a shooting outside Sumner, a 17-year-old disciple shot by a vice lord. He came home shaking, his sketchbook untouched. Dolores held him, whispering prayers, while Marcus met with Curtis to expand the youth program. "We're losing them," Curtis said, his voice low. Marcus nodded, thinking of Ricky Jones, of Larry Jenkins, of the line his mother Alma had warned him about. The year ended with a vigil for Larry Jenkins at Mount Zion Baptist on December 20th. Reverend Brooks led the service, his sermon fierce, "We are not invisible." Marcus stood with Dolores, Tanya, and Michael, their breath visible in the cold. The CBL trial loomed, Weiss's threats lingered, and Lawndale's streets grew darker. But Tanya's solar panel sat on the mantle, Michael's latest drawing, a family holding hands, hung on the wall, and Dolores's Freedom Fund jar grew heavier. Marcus looked at his family, their faces lit by candlelight. The line in the concrete was still there, but they were carving their own path across it. Chicago, Illinois, 1976. Marcus Thompson stood on the front stoop of their Lawndale bungalow, the January wind biting through his work jacket. At 35, his welder's frame was stooped from years of overtime at Pullman Standard and the weight of a city that seemed designed to break him. The Ross v. Weiss et al. Lawsuit, now in its second year, hung over the Thompsons like a storm cloud. Leonard Weiss, their contract seller, had frozen evictions after a preliminary ruling, but his lawyers were stalling, dragging the trial into 1976. Dolores, 33, was a pillar of resolve, juggling her nurse's aide shifts at Provident Hospital with CBL organizing and parenting. Tanya, 13, and Michael, 10. Their home on South Kedzie Avenue was a sanctuary, its marigolds defiant against the cracked pavement, but Chicago's lines, red-line neighborhoods, underfunded schools, predatory police, threatened to erase it. The CBL was fighting on two fronts, the courtroom and the streets. On February 8, 1976, Marcus and Dolores joined a march of 400 contract buyers to the Illinois State Capitol in Springfield, demanding a state investigation into discriminatory housing. Clyde Ross led the charge, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "We're taxpayers, not tenants." Tanya, now a lanky teenager with a sharp mind, marched beside them, her sign reading, "Justice for our homes." Michael stayed with Ella May Carter, sketching protest scenes to cope with the tension. The Chicago Defender covered the march, noting the CBL's growing support from black churches and labor unions. The Chicago Tribune dismissed it as a publicity stunt, quoting Governor James Thompson, no relation to Marcus, who claimed housing was a local issue. Marcus crumpled the paper at Curtis Hayes's barbershop, where Curtis, now 42, shaved heads and dispensed truth. "They'll dodge till we force their hand." The trial was a slog. Charles Good, the CBL's lawyer, presented damning evidence. Weiss's firm had targeted black families in Lawndale, selling 300 homes at inflated prices since 1960. A 1975 HUD report cited by Good showed black Chicagoans paid 35% more per square foot than white buyers in nearby suburbs. But Weiss's lawyer, Robert Kaplan, spun a narrative of risky investments, blaming buyers for signing contracts they didn't understand. Marcus, sitting in the Dirksen Federal Building's gallery, felt the insult burn. He'd signed for Tanya's future, for Michael's dreams, not for Weiss's greed. Dolores squeezed his hand, her eyes on Ruth Wells, who testified again, her voice breaking. "I paid $40,000 for a $15,000 house. Where's my equity?" The judge promised a ruling by summer, but Marcus wasn't holding his breath. Lawndale's streets grew meaner. The vice lords and disciples were at war, their turf battles spilling into schools and parks. On March 12, 1976, a stray bullet shattered a window at Sumner Elementary, where Tanya and Michael studied. The school went on lockdown, and Dolores at the hospital didn't hear until Marcus called from a payphone, his voice shaking. "They're safe, but I'm done with this," he said. He and Dolores met with Gloria Jenkins, the parent council leader, to demand metal detectors and security. Gloria, now 41, was blunt. "The board won't pay for black kids' safety." She organized a boycott, pulling 200 students from Sumner on March 20th. Marcus took a sick day to join, standing with Dolores as Tanya read a speech to reporters. "We deserve to learn without fear." The Defender printed her words. The Tribune ignored them. The board installed one detector, a half measure, but Dolores's book drive grew, amassing 400 books by April. Police violence was relentless. On May 1st, 1976, a 22-year-old named Denise Carter, no relation to Ella May, was killed by a white officer, Patrick Malone, during a traffic stop on Roosevelt Road. Malone claimed Denise reached for a weapon. Witnesses said she was unarmed, her hands raised. The Afro-American Patrolmen's League, led by Renault Robinson, called for an investigation, and 600 residents marched to the 11th District Station, Marcus and Dolores among them. Curtis Hayes, carrying a megaphone, demanded Malone's badge. Ella May, whose son Jamal had been beaten in 1974, wept as she spoke. "How many more?" Marcus added Malone's name to his notebook, now a ledger of grief. The march led to a public hearing, but Malone was cleared, the city citing insufficient evidence. The Defender ran an editorial, "Chicago's finest or Chicago's foe." Marcus taped it to the fridge beside Tanya's STEM award. Tanya was changing. At 13, she was reading James Baldwin and Angela Davis, her science notebooks filled with quotes about justice. She joined Greater Salem's Youth Council, mentored by Reverend Brooks, and started a petition for a school library. Michael, quieter, was struggling. The shooting at Sumner left him jumpy, his drawings darker, cityscapes with shadowed figures. Dolores enrolled him in a summer art camp at the Southside Community Art Center, where black artists like Margaret Burroughs taught. Marcus, stretched by work, made time to attend Michael's camp showcase on July 10, 1976. Michael's painting, A Family Under a Glowing Sun, brought tears to his eyes. "That's us, Daddy," Michael said, his voice soft. Marcus hugged him, vowing to shield that light. The CBL faced setbacks. In June, Weiss's firm filed a countersuit, accusing the CBL of extortion through the payment strike. The move scared some members. 50 families dropped out, paying Weiss to avoid eviction. Marcus and Dolores stayed, their Freedom Fund jar now holding $200. At a CBL meeting on July 15th, Clyde Ross rallied the group. "They want us to quit. We won't." Dolores volunteered to organize a fundraiser, selling plates of fried chicken and greens at Greater Salem to cover legal fees. The event, held August 7th, raised $1,500, with Tanya and Michael serving lemonade. Curtis played Stevie Wonder's "Living for the City," and the crowd sang along, their voices a shield against despair. Personal losses hit hard. On September 5, 1976, Ella May Carter suffered a stroke, her health worn down by years of stress. Marcus and Dolores visited her at Cook County Hospital, where Jamal, now 18, sat by her bed. "She fought for us," Jamal said, his voice thick. Ella May recovered but couldn't sew, leaving Jamal to support the family. Marcus gave him $50 from the Freedom Fund, knowing it wasn't enough. Dolores, practical as ever, started a meal train for the Carters, with Greater Salem families pitching in. By fall, the CBL trial neared a verdict. On October 20th, the judge ruled partially in the CBL's favor, declaring Weiss's contracts unconscionable, but stopping short of voiding them. Weiss was ordered to renegotiate terms for 200 families, including the Tom Trailers, cutting the interest rate to 6%. It was a victory, but incomplete. Full ownership was still years away. Marcus and Dolores celebrated quietly, splitting a peach cobbler at the Ben Moore Hotel. Tanya, now a youth council leader, spoke at a CBL rally. "This is our home, and we're keeping it." The Defender printed her photo, her fist raised. The year ended with a Christmas service at Greater Salem on December 25th. Reverend Brooks preached about resilience, his voice lifting the congregation. Marcus held Dolores's hand, Tanya and Michael between them. Lawndale's gangs, police, and Weiss's shadow loomed, but the Thompsons stood firm. Tanya's petition had 500 signatures, Michael's paintings lined the church hall, and the Freedom Fund jar held $250. The line in the concrete was deep, but their roots were deeper.